Dear experts and participants in today's online workshop, Leaving No One Behind, Carbon Pricing Effects Across Households. The year 2020 was supposed to be an important year with many opportunities to bring climate change and climate protection to the center of public awareness. Instead, our attention was drawn to a pandemic which still holds the world hostage. While we are in the midst of fighting COVID-19, we must not lose sight of the fact that global warming and climate change continue to challenge mankind. And this challenge will still exist once we have succeeded to control the virus. What can be learned from the current health crisis is that national well-being always depends on global well-being. If the international community fails to fight global warming and climate change, we will all find ourselves in a very unsettled world. Therefore, it takes joint and determined actions to prepare for a resilient and sustainable future. In order to achieve the climate goals set out in the Paris Agreement, everyone in the international community must make their contribution. Dear participants, the European Union has its roots in the European coal and steel community. Coal and steel were once the basis for economic growth and better living conditions. Today, our challenge is to make our industries and societies sustainable and future-proof. We have to get out of carbon-based industries. The European Green Deal is our modern growth strategy on our way to a climate neutral and resource-saving economy by 2050. To achieve this target, we need a comprehensive package of measures. These include investments in innovative technologies, climate-friendly infrastructure, and also carbon pricing. We must move away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energies and greater energy savings. Market-based incentives are considered to be very important in this context. We believe that carbon pricing is an efficient way to reduce emissions, and it would be desirable if as many countries as possible would introduce carbon pricing. And yet we have to be aware, and we are learning during that present health crisis, that it will not be possible to follow successfully a path of transition without broad public acceptance. It is therefore essential to consider the needs of those who are immediately and materially affected by structural change. That is why I'm very happy that experts from Israel and Germany have gathered today in this important online workshop to exchange their knowledge and perspectives on the best strategies to shape the transition to a low carbon economy. Please let me express my sincere gratitude to the Israel Public Policy Institute and the Heinrich-Böll Foundation Israel for initiating this workshop in the framework and with support of the German Foreign Office Climate Fund. I would also like to thank all participants for contributing with their expertise and knowledge, not only to the shaping of the transition to a low carbon economy, but also to the shaping of our common future. So I wish you a lot of success. Thank you very much, and toda rabba.
IPPI is an independent, nonprofit policy think and do tank working at the intersection of society, technology, and the environment with the goal of catalyzing fresh thinking on some of the main challenges facing our societies from an international and interdisciplinary perspective. Alongside our research activities, we regularly create formats for exchange of views and best practices between public policy professionals in Israel and abroad in order to promote international cooperation and to catalyze learning processes and the formulation of relevant hands-on policy-oriented solutions for shared societal dilemmas and challenges. Our expert workshop today is a good example of such a format, offering researchers and practitioners from Israel and Germany the opportunity to come together and exchange know-how and perspectives and capitalize on the wealth of knowledge that exists beyond one's national borders. And indeed, tackling the climate crisis is such a grand shared challenge, which requires not only extensive systematic changes at the national level, but also the promotion of close international dialogue and cooperation. We strongly believe that today's workshop, which will be devoted to exploring the societal implications of a carbon price in Israel, will contribute to generating new knowledge on the issue and support the Israeli transition process to a low carbon economy. I would like to thank Dr. Jan Steckel and Leonard Mispach from MCC, who conducted an incredibly insightful analysis of the effects of a carbon price on Israeli households, and which of course will be presented later on. And I would also like to thank Yuval from the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Lior Gallo from the Bank of Israel for their fruitful cooperation around this workshop. On the German side, special thanks to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation Tel Aviv for their ongoing support of our work to promote German-Israeli dialogue on sustainability. And of course, I would also like to extend a special thanks to the German Climate Fund, represented by the German Embassy in Israel, and especially to the science attaché Barbara Steinmetz, who made this German-Israeli dialogue possible in the first place. I wish you all an interesting and enriching workshop.
Today, we're talking about this workshop is taking part of a broader project. It's titled Shaping the Transition to a Low Carbon Economy Perspectives from Israel and Germany. And it is an initiative by the Israel Public Policy Institute and ourselves. And it is carried out in partnership with the Israeli Ministry of Environmental Protection, with generous support, as mentioned before me, with the German Climate Fund, which is represented by the German Embassy in Israel. The aim of the project is to facilitate exchange of knowledge, best practices between these communities of experts from different disciplines, from environment and economics and finance and energy, and to think on the decarbonization strategies in both countries and generate actionable insights on various dimensions of the transition process. This year, the focus of the project is on 3 issue areas. One is the effects of implementing a carbon price, so the effects on the public and the society, the industry. The second topic is climate legislation, and the third is transportation, and more specifically, the potential of shared mobility and supporting decarbonization processes.
Germany and Israel both face the challenge of this transition. 30 years ago, Germany was an environmental leader in Germany and Europe. And the Red-Green Coalition in 1998 to 2005 created a subsidized system which triggered path-breaking expansion of renewables. In the recent decade, the grand transformation has lost its way in Germany, and at the moment we are also far from reaching our targets. Therefore, last year, the German government has presented a climate package for the country to reach its 2030 climate targets. After months of deliberation, Germany has among other measures, for the first time, put a price on the pollution in the transport and heat sectors and the national carbon pricing mechanisms. And there were many topics that were debated in Germany in the last years, which are also relevant for the discussion in Israel. First of all, many countries have introduced a price on carbon, but the main question is under which conditions carbon pricing is effective in reducing emissions. And secondly, and this will be the focus of today's workshop, what are the distributional effects of a carbon tax? Will it burden poor households more than rich households in relation to net income? So what are the possibilities to keeping a carbon price socially fair? And this is really an important discussion, as there is already some public opposition in Germany to various aspects of the climate package.
So the first question is, why do we need to put a price on carbon? And for this, we did a very extensive economic review, and we found out that currently the Israeli market does not internalize the full social cost of carbon. And there is a gap, a significant gap when we compare the taxes on different kinds of fuels relatively to their environmental external costs. And you can see the figures down, but I won't dwell in them. We heard about them in the first workshop. So we did that. The second question that we looked upon is, okay, so there is no internalization of the social cost, but what is the social cost of carbon? And we did figure out the number. The number is $42, and it happens to be also the answer to the ultimate questions of life, the universe, and everything. So that we also did, and we presented it in the first workshop as well. Then we asked, how will carbon pricing contribute to the reduction of GHG? And for this, we used the help of the expertise of Professor Ruslan Palatnik, with Yele Davidovich, and the message macroeconomic model based in Yassa, Austria. And the findings were quite impressive. Carbon tax that will internalize the full social cost of carbon will reduce 67% of greenhouse gases emissions by 2050. So this is a highly effective policy tool, according to this analysis. The fourth question is, will carbon pricing affect the economic growth? And also here we use the message model, and with the help of Nathan Zussman, we did an extensive work on the macroeconomic impacts of the transition to a low carbon economy. And the findings were also very interesting. We found out that even without taking into account the full negative impacts of climate change and air pollutions that are estimated by billions of dollars to the Israeli economy, still the transition to a low carbon economy will barely affect the economic growth. Then we asked, okay, so if this is the case, do other countries put a price on carbon? And also here, the numbers are pretty staggering. 95% of OECD countries have a carbon pricing mechanism already in place, other than Israel and Turkey.
The results show that there is some, under different assumption on the parameters and the level of competition and where the shock will hit, we have different results on the level of emission. The level of emission will decrease between 0 almost and 20%. This is the span depending on the type of shock and the level of substitution level. But so, as I told you, I'm not going to talk about the numbers, but on general, on the fact that this is not enough. This is not like decreasing the emission in Israel by 20% is obviously it's something that we want, but it's not enough to get to our targets. Israel was during the 2015 agreement, Paris Agreement, Israel was obligated to reduce its emission per capita to certain levels. It's written all over in this graph, and we will probably reach the levels to which we were obligated in 2015, but we know today that those levels are not enough. We know today that the European Green Deal speaks about decreasing the levels of emission to net zero. This is the new target. This is where we need to head. And 20%, even 20%, our highest level of decrease in emission is not enough to get to those targets.
I see that Yossi already in the room has a question. And if you have other questions, like if people digitally present, just raise your hand.
Thank you. Just a short question. I am not sure if I got you correctly. I think you started by asserting that if the storage price falls sharply, it will not have any implication. Is that correct? Or
20% decrease, obviously it will have implication. Not as much as we want. It will have implication. I showed you that the decrease in the decrease in emission can go up to 20%. And that's being said, you need to understand that in a general equilibrium model, in which each shock affects all the other sectors, a decrease in the price of electricity means a decrease in the price of energy. Other sectors, also polluting sectors, will benefit from this phenomena, from the decrease. The market becomes more productive. Everybody becomes more productive. So there is a transmission mechanism in these types of models that if one sector benefits, all the sector benefits from this productivity, because all the sectors will have lower costs.
We here calculate the distributional incidence of carbon pricing, that is the overnight effect. So we disregard general equilibrium effects and behavioral effects, and I'm happy to discuss this further in the discussion. We analyze how households in different income groups, as well as following particular properties, for example, rural versus urban households, various segments of the society compare. And then we look into various compensation schemes. So how would actually the distributional effects change if we introduce particular compensation schemes? And finally, we look into typical households. So we have written a report, and I think I'm quite confident you can all already have access to this report if you want. I wanted to, so like the previous discussion was already quite advanced. I was not totally sure about your understanding of economic models. So for those who are totally familiar with this, apologies, but I think it's important to really understand what we did, and we thought a little bit how to explain it in an accessible way. So how do we model this distributional incidence? So basically, what we have to say is based on a representative household survey data that cover the year 2018, that we take of the Central Bureau of Statistics, covering approximately 8,800 households. So, and how we now come to the distributional incidence, let me just make this clear at an example of a typical household: 2 adults, 3 children living in the Gush Dan area with an average income and 2 cars. So we use this household data where households report very detailed what they consume and what their consumption expenditures are, differentiated by various consumption items. How much do they spend for electricity? How much do they spend for transport? How much do they spend for food? How much do they spend for washing machines? All kinds of issues that you possibly can consume. And actually, we know how much they spend for this in shekels. Then we use a multi-regional input-output model that we have available at the MCC, which we can use to derive sector-specific embedded CO2 intensity. So this GTAP model has 65 sectors, so we need to do some mapping because there are more consumption items than actually sectors in the model. From this, we get kind of sector-specific CO2 intensities and can use them to actually compute how much CO2 is, if you like, embedded in the consumption. In this particular case, the household consumes goods that are that refer to approximately 25 tons of CO2. So next, we can then actually derive the additional costs that a household will face from a carbon price of, in this case, we always calculate it with 140 Israeli shekel per ton of CO2, which then gives us the absolute burden and can also be used to calculate the total additional overnight costs. This is the pure, more or less classical result of the distributional effects in Israel. You see actually the population divided into 10 expenditure deciles. At the very left, you see the poorest 10%. At the very right, you see the richest 10%. You see that this effect would be regressive. So if you look into the average or the median values, then the richest households are less affected than the poorest, and also notable that the poorer households are more heterogeneously affected. That means that within this income decile, you also find kind of households that are very much affected. So in this case, nearly 6% or higher. So let's look a little bit into the geographical scope. So we looked into various areas. So first of all, if you look only into Tel Aviv, you find that it is more or less mirroring the national effects. Looking into other cities of Gush Dan, they are slightly more affected than households in Tel Aviv across all income groups. Other larger cities and medium-sized cities, so larger cities are Jerusalem, Beersheba, and Haifa, are comparably affected as the Gush Dan area and Tel Aviv. But what is now very interesting is that we see a kind of significant difference when looking into the more rural areas. So both small cities and real rural areas, which would be across all income groups be significantly higher affected than the more urban areas. Let's have a look into different segments of the population. So again, here you see the 5 income. Now we look into quintiles and various groups of the population. So in red, you see again the national-wide population and then how various groups compare. What is interesting is 2 things. First is that Arab households would be much higher affected than Jewish and Jewish Orthodox households, and Jewish Orthodox households are least affected in relative terms when looking into the society through this lens. And one explanation is that those groups are using transportation differently, living into different areas, being more or less dependent on commuting, and we look into this in a second. So indeed, when looking into whether or not a household owns a car, indeed leads to different results. So you can clearly see that car ownership indeed is a driver to additional costs, with people who own a car, independent, whether it is 1 or 2 cars, are more affected. And then, interestingly, also to look into the mode of transportation. So whether it is people mainly use individual transport, mainly public transport, or do not have transport expenditures. There are also households that do not have transport expenditures. And you can see that those with actually who own a car are significantly higher affected than those that use public transportation.
I'm wondering about the timing of the tax, because I'm not sure that the storage technology is ready to give answer to the business sector in order to shift from to that direction, to the PV or to renewable energies. So if you put a tax when the technology and the infrastructure is not ready, so it will only cost more to the business sector, but won't do the shift you want to achieve.
Like one important thing that the tax does is that it signals the commitment of the regulator, right? So also to the businesses. So if you are a business and you need to kind of decide on your investments in the future, then you kind of take all kind of things into account. Do I invest into technology X or into technology Y? Do I actually make this investment, or do I need to make another one? And actually, for this, putting a carbon price and a clear pathway is tremendously important, because this is what we find in other research, that kind of this question of time consistency, of commitment, actually, of kind of how credible the regulator is with actually putting a climate target forward, is tremendously important for business. And just maybe for your information, in Germany, it is particularly industry associations who call for a carbon price exactly out of these reasons, because they want to have a clear regulatory frame rather than some vague target that they do not necessarily know what does it mean for my business.
Last year, the OECD published an interesting review of empirical studies, meaning ex post studies, that investigated all sorts of possible effects of carbon pricing on competitiveness. And this review shows that most studies found no statistically significant effect of carbon pricing on competitiveness. And there was another work with quite similar results published also last year by the World Bank. And however, these findings are also explained by carbon prices being effectively low because of tax exemptions. And in the context of trading systems, there were generous free emission allowances. But still, those are interesting papers, and they provide some framing to this discussion. First, when we think of carbon pricing and how it affects competitiveness, we naturally think of increase of costs of production as an exogenic factor. And the OECD calls it a first order effect. The increase of production costs leads to second order effects, meaning the response of the firms to the production cost increase. And the firms can respond by changing supply quotas or changing prices. But anyway, the ability to roll the cost downstream to the end consumer really depends on the position of each firm in the market. But anyway, this is just a short-term perspective. And looking further ahead, we should take into account long-term consequences, or as the OECD call it, third-order effects, where we meet broader economic, international, and technological outcomes. And these could be increase of productivity and energy and material efficiency, and of course, innovation. Carbon pricing drives innovation in clean technologies to a large extent, and in the long run, innovation is the key channel to keep and improve competitiveness of firms. There is robust empirical evidence, according to the OECD, on the impact of carbon pricing. All studies report statistically significant increases in patent activity in response to carbon pricing. And in the broader view, setting high environmental standards drives innovation. We see it in our work at the ministry, where we have a program to boost and support environmental technologies here in Israel. We support Israeli clean tech startups, and we see that they develop solutions in response to regulation. And when we analyze the potential market share works that they submit to us, we see that they depend highly on environmental regulation in the market that they target. So to summarize this very brief framing of this part of the discussion, it is reasonable to assume, and there is some limited evidence, that in the short term, we can expect some negative effect of carbon pricing on competitiveness. However, in the long run perspective, carbon pricing could be very, very beneficial to productivity, efficiency, and of course, innovation. And one last point, it is not the taxation itself or the trading system per se that hinders competitive advantage. Carbon leakage happens when there are different pricing regimes between trading countries. And that is why the subject of border tax adjustment is highly linked to any discussion on international competitiveness. And we will too discuss it here just a little later on. I will stop here and let my friends from EcoTraders present the result of an initial analysis that they performed in our request, where they assessed the impact of carbon pricing on local industry here in Israel.
So concluding basically this part of the analysis, what we've seen is that industry in Israel is not an energy-intensive industry in global terms. Particularly in global terms, we would not be considered to be vulnerable industries. If we look at the overall tax burden without second order and third order effects, we're looking at a range from 0.6 to about 1.5% of revenue, depending on the subsector. Implementation of an emission reduction pathway that's been discussed, which is fairly conservative also, I should say, in its assumptions regarding the energy efficiency measures and fuel switching measures that industry will take, could reduce this burden by 40%. And 4 of the sectors, which together account for less than a third of industrial revenue, have been identified as those that are being relatively vulnerable. And relative is in bold for a reason, because it's looking relative to other Israeli sectors and not necessarily relative to global sectors. They would be relatively vulnerable in the short term to impacts on their competitiveness.
Some thoughts, what does this mean for Israel? 3 aspects I had in my mind that might be very interesting for you. Firstly, if the EU, which is the main trade partner for Israel, as far as I know, imposes such a border carbon adjustment, you have to pay the price anyway for the exports to the EU. But it makes a difference whether you have the carbon price in Israel, then the revenues go to the public budget in Israel, or if you have the EU BCA, then the revenues go to the EU or one of the member states. So this makes an important difference, I would say. Then from an implementation level, you're in a much more favorable situation than the European Union. First, because you can just introduce it at the national level and don't have these very complex multi-level governance issues that I mentioned. Then you're thinking about a carbon tax, which is much easier with a carbon tax than with a permit system, because you know which price you need to fix, and you also have the opportunity to reimburse exporters if you like, which could be actually politically very important to make this more attractive, to get more political clout into such a proposal. And finally, following up to Jan's presentation, what are the distribution implications of a border tax, border carbon adjustment? Of course, energy-intensive imports become more expensive. So this would actually harm some industries, some households. I don't know what exactly the implications are for Israel, but for most countries that I've seen studies, you can expect that the distribution implications of the border carbon adjustment are very similar to those of a carbon price, because the kind of consumption shares on imported and domestic produced goods are not that different. So you might expect some slight regressivity in isolation. But as you've seen with the carbon price, you need some kind of revenue recycling anyway. And there you might actually want to also consider the distribution impacts of the border carbon adjustment, which are of course much lower than for the pure carbon price, because the share of things produced and consumed from domestic production is much higher than for imports. And final thing, also here, it's very important not only to look at the averages, but also to look at outliers, whether there are some populations or some industries that are highly reliant on imports for some reason or another, and whether they need some kind of special treatment to prevent hardships.